Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you. This is Doug.
And I'm Cody.
Glad to be back.
Oh, I'm so glad to be back. In the heart of Decula on a nice Thursday midday.
Yeah, Decula, which the reason we're here is because Decula has been known way back as the founding of some of the most intellectual, philosophical
I can't even take that
Cody.
Can't even take that serious.
You can't. No, what's great about what we're saying is that all spaces are spaces for this kind of conversation.
Yes.
And so, but I'm glad to be here in Decula, and Cody and I want to get as many of you here as we possibly can. That's why we're going to be doing events here over time. That's why Cody and I, we just finished a meeting with a pastor from Brooklyn, New York. So we're having meetings with folks, leaders, tribal leaders, et cetera, and so thankful and blessed to have a great property here in Decula, just about 6 acres, and we have this big place where Cody and I are sitting right now to, again, enable and promote this conversation.
And side note, beautiful pond with an amazing waterfall, and I go out there and I sit there, and just a little sneak peek for the listeners, I sometimes light up a cigar and have a drink and talk about the things that matter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was out there yesterday with, day before with a guest. And that's where real conversation does happen. And that's what this is about, real conversation. And it's why we keep stressing that even though we're talking about things theological and eschatological, that those words can be a real turnoff to a lot of people with the baggage they've had coming into 2018 and beyond. But they are so relevant when we reinterpret the way that they impact my understanding of transformation.
Yeah, and that's why I've been enjoying this series. And for those that are keeping score at home, this is Eschatology Part 6. And it's really critical. I went back and did a little research. In the world I grew up in, Tim LaHaye left behind all of this particular genre of eschatology. Doug, interesting fact, they sold more than 50 million copies of that particular book. Made kids' book, board games, websites, movies, loads of spin-offs. So it's like, I knew, Doug, intuitively at some point, when my eschatology that I have been taught demanded and in some ways required the utter destruction of the planet.
Yeah.
I knew there was a moment specifically when you would see things with the United Nations and their longing for peace, that for me, my interpretation, what I was taught was, well, we actually don't need peace because a peace plan is going to thwart the actual coming of this Christ. And Doug, it was at that moment that this thought hit me.
Sure.
My eschatology is anti-Christ.
Yes. Yeah. Which is a big subject for all those within a more fundamentalistic view who are always trying to find out there in the newspaper or on the news that Antichrist.
Yes. When peace plans in the Middle East are a bad thing, my friends, your eschatology has become anti-Christ.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Come on, Doug.
And, and I don't know if you ever had the board game, but if you have the board game, you know that you've lost when you're the only one left in the room at the board and everyone else got raptured out. And so that's how you know you've lost.
Which today, I know we want to talk about. There's so much that I want to talk about, but I do want to give a little inside peek. The next couple episodes coming up, I really want to drive down into the narrative and look at some of the verses for judgment, great white throne, sheep, goats. Talk about the resurrection of the dead.
Yep.
Because I've done a number of funerals where I have heard people talk about literal bones coming together.
Yes.
An actual literal resurrection of the dead. And then also we need to talk about rapture.
Oh, yeah.
But today, before we get there, we have been talking about the 4 quadrants of Ken Wilber, the individual and the collective, and the individual being Jesus himself and the collective being the body of Christ. And we've spent some time talking about the body of Christ in the context of eschatology, the death of internals and externals. So externals for us, we'd spent a lot of time talking about the temple.
Yeah.
And eschatology for us starts at the cross, you'll see in the Venn diagram, and ends with the temple, 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. And so we spent a lot of time in the last episode talking about that. Today, what I thought would be good, Doug, is let's talk about cosmology.
Okay,
in the context of eschatology. Okay, when you talk about cosmology, where do you start with folks?
In the beginning. That's the story. You know, every narrative has a beginning and it has an end. And we're talking about both the beginning and the end when we're talking eschatology. And so in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that creation was an external creation. And as you brought up to me, in fact, as we did preparation for this is actually the creation of form. And in Eastern religion, if you are talking about ground of being, essence, it is from the ground of being, from formlessness, that form arises. So the things that we're talking about, we're going to see in the biblical narrative, are not just unique to the biblical narrative. What we're actually going to find is that we can have some very interesting conversations with people who have other narratives. And we are going to do that down the road, by the way. We are going to be bringing people in and having conversations with them. But to answer the question of where it begun, it was in Genesis 1:1. The first cosmology is related to external form. In fact, what's interesting is that when matter was first beginning to coalesce, the narrative says that everything was void and without form. Now, how was it that this void, without form universe became usable for plants and animals and humans? It only became usable when God created form. And how did God create form? By separating. He separates the land from the sea from the sky, the birds of the air, the animals of the land. Everything that God did in terms of separation was so that it could be a usable world of form.
In the beginning, God created form.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a necessary part. That's why we're saying that formlessness is not the absence of form, it's detachment from form. That my identity is not my biological form, because that's what gets created at the end of this creation narrative, this story in the beginning, is that the last form that gets created is the biological form. And that as the narrative goes along, this introduction of my essence, God-breathed spiritual essence, is going to tell me that I am actually more than that form, and yet my spiritual essence is integral to my biological form. So it's not the absence of my form, but rather it is detachment from my form, so that I know that my biology, even down to things like I see on Facebook all the time, people that are openly talking about their struggle with their physical biology. There's a huge emphasis on how do I look compared to other people, and how strong am I, how fit am I, on and on we can go, how pretty, how handsome, on and on we go. We struggle with the form that God gave us from the very beginning of time. But back to your point, it is a story where the cosmology of in the beginning begins with a cosmology of form.
Okay, so you see throughout the biblical narrative that this creation poem talks about, in the beginning, the divine created the heavens and the earth. And then all of a sudden, as you begin to fast forward, you begin to see something transpire with this particular form of heaven and earth. And then you begin to hear the prophets even start talking about, wait for it, a new heaven and a new earth. So when we talk about cosmology in the context of eschatology, that's why the eschatological issues matter, because you start the narrative with heaven and earth, and then it seems to end with a new heaven and a new earth. So it's almost as if we have two cosmologies.
Absolutely. Just like in the spiral, it's almost like we have two tiers, and we do. And we do, because that's the nature of nature. And that's why we use models, again, like spiral, because what others are saying, whether they're religious or non-religious, is that there are certain patterns that seem to apply to our human existence, to the universe, and all those kind of things. And that why shouldn't we expect that God nature to also be on display throughout the narrative? And that's why it would start with a heavens and earth that apply to external form. And why, as you said, the prophet Isaiah, you get to around Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, for those of you that want to look at this, and Isaiah is introducing the thought that there will be a new heaven and a new earth that is going to set the stage for all of this new creation talk.
Yeah, I was thinking about these two cosmologies, and it appears that the creation poems, the heaven and earth, at some point was in bondage, if you're reading the narrative, to this sin and death.
Yes.
And the writers even talk about how it was groaning.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, so again, Jesus is transform, and that's because there was a bondage that was created in form. Again, you cannot have bondage without boundary. The boundary was an internal consciousness form of obedient, pleasing to God, faithful, believer, versus unfaithful, unbeliever, disobedient, all of which, of course, was subject to debate among those of Israel, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all the way down through the form Christianity, which we will eventually get to. That's where we're headed. It's a lot easier if we just focus on Israel and don't talk about Christianity.
Well, Doug,
Yeah.
I find that to be...
Have you noticed that too?
Yes. You know what? It's just... I think it was Katie Byron who talks about... She wrote a book called Loving What Is.
Yes.
I think that's
Yeah.
right. Or Byron Katie.
Yeah, Byron Katie, yeah.
She talks about how... This is a great line. She's just like, yeah, it's always the projection, but never the projector.
There you go. Exactly.
It's just like,
Yeah.
it's very convenient to pinpoint an enemy at least once a week for me, because it keeps the focus off my own shadow work.
There you go. And so yeah, you have this idea of this bondage in this first creation, and you're talking about that bondage for those that would like to read, and we'll have this in the show notes. Take a look at Romans 8, and what you'll see in Romans 8 is Paul talking about a new creation coming, and that's where you get from the narrative this term of being a new creature. Well, new creatures make up a new creation. And so what was happening was, and that takes transformation. How do you get from being an old creature to a new creature? How do I get from being a false self to a true self? It is going to come through an eschatological transformation of dying and rising. And so Paul will say in that 8th chapter of Romans, for the creation, that first heavens and earth and all the people that lived in it, their temples, their priesthood, their religious sacrifices, that creation was made subject to bondage because, again, it created a sin and death thinking consciousness paradigm. The creation was made subject to bondage not willingly, but by the will of him who subjected it as such, meaning that it wasn't Israel's idea to go come up with 10 commandments. It wasn't Israel's idea to come up with the law. The law was given to Moses, and so we always think about law and Moses together. But that law then evolved and got a lot more specific into 600 plus different laws. And so that creation was made subject to bondage not willingly, but by the will of the one who subjected it. Why? Because God is teaching human beings, he's teaching me, that if I'm going to use boundary-driven thinking for the purpose of coming to God, he, she, it, and then claiming or asking or trying to be one with or pleasing to, it'll never work. And that was the frustration. So made subject not willingly, but by the will of him, that this creation that was groaning and travailing, and that's what comes when you're in bondage, a groaning, that's what they were feeling right then, that it might be delivered. By the way, God is the deliverer in the story, into the glorious freedom. Freedom stands against bondage, which means that freedom is going to belong in the Venn diagram to the circle formlessness, into the glorious freedom of the sons and daughters of God. It's a God story start to end. And so we've moved from a creation of form to a creation which is formless, because the essence, the freedom, comes not from the absence of form, but from detaching from form. And so God, or the story, is presenting cosmology for us to see the nature of form and formlessness. And it's just another, the narrative is full of these patterns.
Oh, okay. I don't want to derail us too much, but
That's fine. We don't have...
We're formless.
We're formless, so we don't have an end. I'm sorry, but these podcasts are endless.
You talk about this heaven and earth and it being in bondage, and it goes away, and there's this new heaven and this new earth. You even see the writers talk about the old covenant at like Mount Sinai, and then these prophets start talking about a new covenant. It just struck me, and we've talked about this for a little while, but
Yeah.
we got to step into this.
Yeah, let's do it.
We didn't learn any lessons, it appears, because it's almost... Because I feel like lots of people, and this, by the way, I'm way off script, so I'm just going for it right now, but lots of people would say, totally agree. And the beautiful picture of an old world and a new world is Judaism and Christianity.
Yes.
And out with the law.
Yeah.
Out with the old world, out with the animal sacrifices, out with all of that. In the new covenant,
Yes.
the new way is Christianity.
Yes.
Here's the problem with that. The problem with that, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of observe this, is that we've embraced the exact same thing in the old world. We just, wait for it, reformed it
Yes.
and called it Christianity.
Yes.
And we didn't experience any transformation at all. All we experienced is reformation.
That's beautiful.
No transformation.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And so exactly what you're saying is that you have a form called a temple, and Jesus came, and he wasn't transformed, he was reformed. So Jesus said, and I'm of course being facetious in this, I tell you the truth, you have worshiped in a temple on Saturday, but I come to tell you, you will worship in a cathedral on Sunday.
Good God.
You have circumcised as a sign of your identity. I tell you that you will now be baptized as the sign of your identity. You are God's denominated people as Israel. I tell you, you will now be denominated under me. And that's how you'll separate yourself from everyone else. This is the last 2,000 years of what we were understanding, because it's the way people thought when Jesus and the apostles were on the scene. Again, we're not trying to say that we are disposing of body of Christ, we're trying to say that body of Christ was never meant to go through time and history as an institutional form. It was a transform, just like Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is not on the earth anymore. And so the body of Christ was a transformative way, I am the way, into a universal human collective wherein we realize that the tribal nature of first tier is transformed from a particularistic tribe to a universal tribe, our global human family.
Oh, God's chosen people.
Yes. And of course, I was one when I proclaimed the particularistic, boundary-driven message I used to have in my blue meme. In the blue traditional stage of my life, I was proclaiming how I was one of the chosen ones, and I could just look out my window and shake my head at all the horrible, poor, just terrible people that, well, they weren't.
And what's interesting is Jesus points to this. That's what's so fascinating about it is, think about it. Judaism in its form.
Yes.
Christianity, a new form.
Yes.
And it's as if Jesus is just like waving his hands, trying to get our attention, going, no. Right. What are you doing? Exactly. No. That's not at all what I intended.
Right.
Jesus never intended for a new form. Otherwise, we would have just stuck around with Judaism. Why would you create a new form?
Reform Judaism. If it was about reforming, why not reform Judaism? Because that was what Jesus was in. God had given the law. Why not just reform Judaism? And Paul is having the same thing as we go along, Cody. You and I know that this means that we'll relook at all the apostolic writings because they were all having this same concern that Jews and Gentiles alike were following the human instinctive tendency of attachment to form for identity. It is a survival instinct of the ego. It's not because people are bad. It's not because Christianity is bad or Judaism is bad. They are natural instinctive desires to find identity through attachment to a form, but they exclude all those who are not part of that form. And the message of God is a message of universal acceptance.
And I genuinely, again, my interpretation, my opinion, I often wonder if Jesus wouldn't shake his head going, I never, ever intended for a new form, let alone slapping on my name as the label of it.
Yeah, I think the first thing he would do is he'd go on Oprah. And if I were him, I would choose the location out in Hawaii that she has.
Absolutely.
And I would go on there, and that's exactly what I'd say. And actually, I've heard Oprah say that she herself, and of course, there are a lot of people who see her as one of the great heretics of all time.
Sure.
But she made the statement, I don't think Jesus came to start another religion. Look, that's not news.
Yep.
The question is, how could that be true on the one hand, and we still have faith communities that are basing everything that they see as transformation in their personal lives on this God story that includes Jesus, includes a body of Christ, includes all these teachings from Genesis through Revelation. How do you keep all of that on the one hand and yet move into this formless realm on the other hand? And that's really getting ahead of the discussion, but it's pointing to where this discussion's going because there's a reason you and I have been spending so much time on form. It's to set the foundation for very deep, radical thinking that we're going to introduce about the future of faith and the future of faith community and the reasons why institutionalism are failing and church buildings are emptying. We're studying, first of all, what happens in form. And we know that form will relate to the realm of the corruptible, and that means that it will not ever be a lasting way to understand our identity.
Which brings me to a point. Before we get out of here, I want to talk about two things. One, we need to talk about the end of the first heaven and earth, and then if we can, before we get out of here, if we have time, I want to talk about violence and suffering for just a minute. Okay, first, the end of the first heaven and earth. Okay, let me read you a verse, 2 Peter 3:10. Okay, now, in the eschatological view that I grew up in, this is the verse they leveraged about how in a future tense the world was going to burn. Okay, so 2 Peter 3:10, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief.
Yes.
I want to read it in their version.
Yes.
The day of the Lord will come like a thief.
Yes.
The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements, here it is, will be destroyed by fire. And the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Not only that, they would read that verse, and then, Doug, one of the most popular hymns of all time we'd sing right behind it, called Amazing Grace. And here's a line from Amazing Grace. The earth shall soon dissolve like snow. The sun forbear to shine. But God who called me here below will be forever mine.
Yes.
The earth will dissolve like snow. The elements will be destroyed by fire.
Yes. And so quickly, there's no way to do anything quickly. Well, we've had these paradigms grilled in the gray matter, so it's difficult for people to understand that Peter is talking about the end of a whole creation he belonged to and grew up in, and that was a creation of doing that centered around Jerusalem, temple, priesthood, and all that we've been talking about, that form was what was going away. And in fact, that word for the elements that are going to disappear, that word for elements is the word stoicheia, that it is in the narrative 5 times only, and in all 5 cases, it means the elements of the law. What was going away was the elements of law in the sense of the identity of that creation. And the new creation would not be governed by law and judgment, where human beings sit around to determine who's of God and who isn't, and then denominate into 30,000 different groups and fight continually over it. That's what was going away, is that divisive paradigm of thinking.
The elements being the law destroyed by fire.
Yeah.
Which even on a historical level, it was.
Yes, it was.
It was, yes.
It was. It literally was.
Wow. All Jerusalem laid siege. Again, Titus, 70 A.D.
Yes.
Fire.
Yes. And genealogy, biology, the tribal identities. Since that day, there's been no tribal identity. No one knows what tribe they're from. I mean, we could go on and on about all the form that came to an end.
Yes. Okay.
It was identity.
In this last section, and I know we got a minute or two, I need to talk about if the first heaven and earth have passed away and the new heaven and earth is here, what about suffering? What about violence? And the reason I ask that is because take the book of Revelation. You think about what the writer says, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain, for the older things have passed away. Behold, I am making all things new. If we're in the new heaven and new earth, what's up with the pain?
Yeah, and I think that is what has been, again, misinterpreted, misrepresented about the human experience. First and foremost, the sorrow and the suffering that has occurred for human beings has been attachment to form, which led to the pain and suffering of that first creation. Remember, it was the one that was groaning. It was the one that was in tears. And that first creation was groaning and having pain because it was put in this bondage to form attachment, which means it was put into the bondage of doing. When I find the peace that passes understanding, I have that available to me now, and I grow in it. And I find that when I use this process of understanding how I'm moving from a form to which I'm in bondage and transforming into a God way of seeing, a formless way of seeing, that God always and continues to wipe away all tears, in the sense that my mourning is always, and suffering is always going to be tied to attachment to form.
Oh, see that is so deep within itself that you can just hear that and be like, what does that mean? Our suffering always has to do with attachment to form.
Yes. Man. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about that more because we have that in common with a lot of the Eastern folks as well who have known this and said this and teach this for centuries, if not millennia, about what pain and suffering is caused by. Only we're going to say, here's the way God has illustrated that, actually illustrated it through history, bringing it to our attention ultimately through Jesus, his body, and that eschatological transformative work.
God has wiped away tears. He is wiping away tears.
Yes.
And that's the good news of the gospel.
Yes.
Is that your essence,
Yes.
your identity
Yeah.
is from the divine.
From the divine, indestructible, and eternal.
Okay, so next podcast, we need to
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about that. Let's talk about judgment.
Yes.
Let's talk about resurrection of the dead, and
Love it.
then let's talk about the rapture. Come on, Doug.
That sounds good to me.
I love it. Hope everyone listening has a fantastic day, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.